It started as an ordinary Saturday morning. The sun was just beginning to peek through the blinds, casting a soft golden light across the kitchen as I poured myself a cup of coffee. I loved this time of day, quiet, peaceful, before the world outside started stirring. I had plans to spend the day relaxing, maybe tackle a few errands, but nothing too exciting. As I sipped my coffee, I gazed out of the window, enjoying the serenity of my backyard. The grass was freshly mowed, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and everything seemed just right. But that peace was quickly shattered. From the corner of my eye, I saw her, Karen from the HOA, strolling down the sidewalk, her eyes scanning the neighborhood like a hawk on the lookout for its next prey. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual to see her out and about, patrolling the area with the self-appointed air of an overseer. As the president of the HOA, she seemed to take it upon herself to monitor everything, from who was parking their car too close to the curb to whether the flower beds in front yards were properly maintained. But this time was different. Karen stopped right at the edge of my yard, just before the tall fence that separated my property from the street. I watched, confused, as she stood there for what felt like an eternity, her gaze fixed on something in my direction. She wasn't just passing through like usual. Something about the way she was standing, taking in the scene, made me uneasy. My instincts kicked in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was eyeing my property for something specific. I tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just admiring the flowers or the way the yard looked. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. It wasn't until later that day, when I was outside checking on the garden, that I realized what had happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flash of something metal gleaming in the afternoon sun. I turned my head, and my heart dropped. There, perched in the corner of my backyard, was a small security camera. It was pointed directly at my back porch, the very spot where I had been enjoying my morning coffee just hours before. For a moment, I froze. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I had no security system, no cameras of my own. I knew for sure that the camera wasn't mine. And that meant one thing. Someone had placed it there. A wave of disbelief washed over me. Karen. It had to be her. No one else in the neighborhood would have taken it upon themselves to install a camera without asking. The HOA had been increasing its security measures lately, but I never imagined that they would go this far. I mean, this wasn't just a simple notice about increased patrols or a new neighborhood watch program. This was an invasion, a breach of privacy. I walked over to the camera and stared at it, my blood beginning to boil. The lens was small but clearly visible, nestled in the branches of one of the trees near the fence. The worst part, it was positioned perfectly to get a clear view of my backyard, my private space. This was no accidental placement. This was deliberate. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I'd heard rumors about the HOA getting more intrusive, but this was something else entirely. How could the HOA think it was okay to put a camera in someone's private backyard? My hands trembled as I took out my phone to snap a picture of the camera, realizing that whatever was happening here was far beyond an innocent mistake. This was a violation of my privacy, and I wasn't going to let it slide. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the thought of what had happened. My backyard, my sanctuary, had been turned into a surveillance zone. I knew I had to do something, but what? The anger inside me grew with each passing minute. I wasn't just mad at Karen. I was mad at the HOA, at the whole idea that they could intrude into my personal space like this. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I was going to find out how far this had gone, and I was going to make sure it never happened again. I couldn't let it go. The camera in my backyard had triggered something in me, an immediate need to confront the situation head on. My blood was still boiling from the shock of finding the surveillance device, and I knew that if I didn't act quickly, things would only escalate further. I grabbed my coat, slammed the door behind me, and marched across the neighborhood toward Karen's house. My thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to leave without them. As I walked, I tried to calm myself down, but my steps quickened as my frustration built. I had never had an issue with Karen before. Sure, she was the type to enforce the tiniest HOA rules with a militant precision, but it had never impacted me directly. Not until now. But this was different. This wasn't a rule violation or a neighborly complaint. This was an invasion of privacy. I had every right to be angry. When I arrived at her house, I took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there waiting. I wasn't sure what to expect, whether she'd play dumb or try to talk her way out of it. All I knew was that I needed her to understand the gravity of what she'd done. The door creaked open, and there she was. Karen. Her bleached blonde hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she stood with that smug, self-satisfied expression I had come to associate with her. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me, but there was no sign of surprise or apology, just a cold, calculating look. "Oh, hello," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Can I help you?" I didn't mince words. "I know what you did, Karen," I said, barely able to keep the anger out of my voice. "There's a camera in my backyard. Why did you install it?" Karen's smile didn't falter. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest, as if preparing for a confrontation. "Oh, that? Well, it's just for your safety. The HOA has decided that we need better surveillance around the neighborhood. To prevent crime." I was taken aback. "My safety?" I repeated incredulously. "I didn't ask for any extra security. My backyard is private property, and you can't just install cameras without permission." She tilted her head, acting as if she didn't understand what the big deal was. "Well, it's for everyone's benefit," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We've been getting complaints, and this will help keep things under control. Don't worry, it's for your own good." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her tone was so casual, as if it was completely normal for someone to show up in your backyard and set up surveillance equipment without even asking. "No, Karen," I said, trying to steady my voice. "That's not how it works. This is my property, and you don't have the right to put a camera in it without my consent. It's illegal." She raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "It's not illegal. The HOA has a responsibility to protect the neighborhood, and we have to do what's necessary to keep everyone safe. Trust me, it's a good thing." I felt my patience start to wear thin. "You're not getting it, are you? I didn't sign up for any of this. You don't get to make decisions about my private space without my say. That camera is coming down, and I expect it gone by the end of the day." Her expression hardened, though the smugness was still there. "If you have a problem with it, take it up with the HOA. I'm just following the rules." I couldn't believe her. "Following the rules? You're the one who decided to place a camera in my yard without even telling me. You didn't even consider that I might not want to be watched like that." I paused, taking a deep breath. "What you've done is an invasion of privacy, Karen, and you're going to regret it." Her smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Oh, I'm sure the HOA will sort it out," she said dismissively, as though she couldn't be bothered with my concerns any longer. "Have a nice day." I stood there for a moment, speechless. What was I even supposed to do with that response? She had no remorse, no real understanding of the violation she had caused. She wasn't interested in listening to me, and it seemed like she genuinely believed that what she had done was justified. As I turned to leave, I felt a deep sense of frustration and helplessness. I had made it clear that this wasn't okay, but Karen didn't care. I knew then that this wasn't going to be a simple fix. I was going to have to fight for my privacy, and the battle wasn't going to be over anytime soon. The confrontation with Karen had left me seething, but I knew the fight was far from over. I couldn't just let it go. I wasn't the type to back down, especially when it came to something as important as my privacy. After leaving her house, I walked straight home, my mind racing with thoughts about what to do next. The camera was still there, mocking me from the corner of my backyard, and I couldn't just ignore it. I had to make sure that Karen and the HOA understood the seriousness of the situation. The first step was to gather information. I had a vague memory of reading through the HOA rules when I first moved into the neighborhood, but I hadn't paid much attention to them since. It was time to revisit those documents. I went inside, grabbed the binder I kept with all the neighborhood bylaws, and flipped through the pages. The more I read, the angrier I became. There was no mention of surveillance cameras, no clause about monitoring private properties, no legal backing for what Karen had done. In fact, everything I read pointed to one thing. The HOA had absolutely no right to interfere with my private property in this way. But I needed more than just the rules to make my case. I wasn't a lawyer, and I didn't have the legal expertise to argue my point effectively. So I picked up the phone and called a friend of mine, a lawyer who had helped me with minor legal matters in the past. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and I knew he'd be able to help me sort this out. When he answered, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help," I said, my voice a mix of frustration and urgency. "Someone installed a security camera in my backyard without my permission, and I need to know if that's even legal." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Who did this?" he asked, sounding intrigued. "The HOA. Karen, the president, is the one who did it. She's acting like it's no big deal, but I'm pretty sure this is a violation." He let out a low whistle. "That's definitely a problem. Installing surveillance equipment on someone's property without their consent? Yeah, that's illegal in most places. It's a breach of privacy, and depending on where you live, it could even be considered a felony. If you want to take this seriously, I'd recommend documenting everything. Get photos of the camera, take video footage, and keep records of all your interactions with Karen and the HOA." His words hit me like a ton of bricks. A felony? I had no idea it was that serious. I immediately began to feel a sense of validation, like I wasn't overreacting after all. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. This was a legitimate legal issue. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering as much evidence as I could. I took photos of the camera from every angle, trying to capture its location and the way it was positioned in my backyard. I also recorded a video of the camera showing its clear view of my porch and garden. It felt strange, like I was gearing up for some sort of battle, but I knew this was necessary. I wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA get away with something so invasive. Once I had enough evidence, I decided it was time to escalate the situation. I wasn't just going to go back to Karen with my concerns. No, this needed to be addressed formally. I wrote up a letter to the HOA, outlining exactly what had happened, the privacy violation I'd experienced, and the legal implications of installing a camera on my property without consent. I also included the photos and videos as proof. In the letter, I demanded that the camera be removed immediately and that they cease any further surveillance activities on my property. The moment I mailed the letter, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had taken the first official step in fighting back. But it wasn't over. I knew Karen wouldn't just roll over and admit defeat. This was going to take time, and it was going to require a lot more persistence. The HOA had a lot of power, and I could tell they weren't used to being challenged. But I wasn't going to let that stop me. I had already come this far, and I wasn't about to back down now. The next few days were a blur of anxious waiting. Every time I walked past my backyard, I half expected to see the camera still there, taunting me. But I knew that the ball was now in the HOA's court, and I wasn't about to let them ignore my demands. I'd taken the first step, and now I just had to wait and see if they would take me seriously. It didn't take long for the HOA to respond. The letter I had sent outlining the violation was met with a formal response a few days later. It was a short letter, almost dismissive, essentially a one-page attempt to brush me off. The HOA's response didn't address the legal implications of the camera installation, nor did it express any real understanding of the violation. Instead, it merely stated that the camera would be reviewed and that they would address the issue in the upcoming board meeting. That was it. A vague promise of action, with no real commitment to resolve the issue. I felt the frustration bubbling up again. Was this all they were going to do? I had given them hard evidence of the breach of privacy, and they responded with a non-committal, bureaucratic letter. It was clear that they weren't going to take me seriously unless I forced the issue further. I wasn't going to just sit back and wait for the HOA to decide whether or not they would take action. If anything, their weak response made it clear that they were trying to avoid addressing the problem head-on. That's when I decided to take the next step. I knew it was time to escalate this beyond just Karen. It was time to make sure that everyone in the neighborhood was aware of what was happening. I began by reaching out to a few neighbors. Not many, but enough to make a difference. I wanted to see if I was the only one who had a problem with the HOA's recent tactics, or if others were feeling the same way. The more I spoke with people, the more I realized that I wasn't alone. Several neighbors had voiced concerns about the increasing surveillance measures the HOA had been implementing, from the cameras to their frequent unannounced inspections of properties. Everyone had felt uncomfortable, but no one had spoken up. Until now. One of my neighbors, Linda, had actually had a similar experience with Karen a few months ago, when Karen had started pushing for more rules about what could be done in the front yards. Linda had been reprimanded for her garden decorations. Simple, tasteful decorations that, in Karen's eyes, didn't match the HOA's approved aesthetic. Linda and a few others had quietly challenged some of the rules, but no one had yet fought back in a way that would truly make the HOA reconsider their overreach. I knew that if I wanted to make an impact, I needed to unite my neighbors, to form a coalition that could push back against the HOA's overbearing control. The more people I spoke to, the more I realized how important it was for us to stand together. We scheduled a meeting that weekend, inviting anyone who was concerned about the HOA's recent actions. The turnout was better than I expected. Around 10 of us showed up, each with their own stories of HOA overreach and concerns about the increasing surveillance measures. We talked about the security cameras, the inspections, and the unwarranted complaints. It was clear that Karen's behavior had crossed a line, and people were tired of feeling watched and judged in their own homes. It felt like a small but powerful rebellion against the intrusive, controlling nature of the HOA. That evening, we drafted a petition which included our complaints about the surveillance cameras and other issues we had with the HOA's rules. The petition emphasized that the HOA's recent actions were overstepping the boundaries of privacy and personal freedom. We agreed that we would present it at the next HOA board meeting, demanding that the cameras be removed and that the HOA revisit their policies regarding surveillance and privacy. It was a nerve-wracking decision, knowing that Karen and the HOA board wouldn't take kindly to our efforts. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this was the only way forward. We needed to be heard. The day of the meeting arrived, and I could barely contain my nerves. My neighbors and I gathered at the local community center where the HOA held its monthly meetings. It was a packed room. Some residents were there to discuss general neighborhood concerns, but many had come specifically to voice their opposition to the recent changes. I could feel the tension in the air as people filed into the room, most of them shooting wary glances at Karen, who was seated at the front with her usual smug expression. When the meeting began, Karen started with the usual pleasantries, but it didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift. One by one, the residents who had concerns about the HOA's growing control took the floor. They spoke about the surveillance cameras, about the inspections, and about the increasing pressure to conform to Karen's personal preferences. Some people shared their stories of feeling harassed or judged for their choices, while others expressed how uncomfortable they felt with the growing sense of being watched. Finally, it was my turn. I stood up, my heart pounding, but I was determined. I presented the petition, which included signatures from nearly every neighbor who had attended our meeting. I also shared my own experience, detailing the way Karen had installed a camera in my backyard without my consent, and how this was not just a violation of my privacy, but a legal issue. I made sure to emphasize that this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. Our homes were our sanctuaries, and no one should feel like they were constantly under surveillance. As I finished speaking, I could see the look of discomfort on Karen's face. The once confident president of the HOA had lost her usual air of superiority. A few other members of the board seemed uneasy as well, and I noticed that a few people were even nodding in agreement. For the first time, Karen's power over the neighborhood seemed to be slipping. After a long, tense silence, the board voted. The motion to remove the security cameras was passed, and they also agreed to review the HOA's policies regarding surveillance and personal privacy. It wasn't the complete overhaul I had hoped for, but it was a victory. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge the growing concerns of the residents, and Karen's unchecked authority had been challenged. As I walked out of the meeting room, I felt a rush of relief and satisfaction. It had been a long, difficult fight, but we had won. The HOA was finally listening. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had my privacy back. My home was once again my sanctuary. But more than that, I realized something important. Sometimes standing up to the powers that be was the only way to ensure that our rights were protected. And while I'd won this battle, I knew that the fight for privacy and freedom in our community wasn't over. It was just beginning.